Ted Miller sat on the edge of the exam table, his fingers fiddling with the edge of the paper sheet that rustled beneath him like autumn leaves underfoot. The room smelled of antiseptic and something faintly sweet, perhaps some kind of fragrance someone had sprayed in an attempt to mask the sterile hospital atmosphere. Ted pushed his glasses up his nose, feeling sweat beading at his temples even though the room was cool. His annual physical was a routine he had been going through for at least 20 years. A routine: blood draw, blood pressure taken, lungs listened to, a few questions about diet and exercise. Nothing special. But this was different. His old doctor, Dr. Harris, had retired a few months ago, leaving behind only a yellowed sign on the door and the memory of his grumpy but good-natured tone. Now Dr. Wellner was in his place, a young woman with sharp cheekbones and watchful eyes that seemed to see more than they needed to. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, checking test results on a clipboard, making notes, asking questions without looking up. Ted didn't like it. He missed Harris's usual grumbling, his old-fashioned jokes about golf and weight gain. Wellner was too professional, too distant, and yet something about her manner made him feel like he was under a microscope. "Mr. Miller," she said, finally putting the clipboard down and looking at him. Her voice was even, but there was a subtle edge to it that Ted couldn't quite place. "Everything's fine, except for a couple of things. Your cholesterol is a little high, but we'll discuss that later. There's something else." She paused, as if choosing her words, and Ted felt his stomach clench. "According to your tests, you're congenitally infertile. This probably isn't news to you, but I feel like I should mention it." Ted froze. The word infertility hung in the air like a heavy, damp fog that would not disperse. He blinked, trying to process what he had heard. His fingers stopped fiddling with the sheets and curled into fists, his nails digging into his palms. "Excuse me, what?" he asked, his voice hoarse, as if someone else were speaking for him. It's some kind of mistake. I have 3 children." Dr. Wellner tilted her head slightly, her eyebrows raised slightly, but her expression remained unreadable. She glanced at the tablet again, as if checking to make sure she hadn't made a mistake. "I know this may be unexpected," she said, a hint of sympathy creeping into her tone, but Ted wasn't listening. His mind had latched onto her words like a rusty nail and was slowly tearing itself apart. "The tests show no active sperm. It's a congenital condition, not acquired. You might want to discuss this with your doctor or your family." "Family?" Ted almost laughed, but the laughter caught somewhere in his throat, turning into a dry cough. He pictured Brad and Mary and William, his kids, his proud, loud, familiar kids. Brad with his lazy grin and his habit of throwing his sneakers all over the house. Mary, who always read books at dinner until Melissa told her off. William, always carrying around a guitar he'd never quite learned to play. His kids, their kids, his and Melissa's. "It's a mistake," he repeated, more firmly now, as if convincing himself. "I have 3 children, 24 years of marriage. This is simply impossible." Dr. Wellner looked at him with something like pity, and that was the worst part. She didn't argue, didn't try to convince him. She just nodded, as if she agreed that he had a right to doubt. "I recommend additional testing to rule out lab error," she said, turning back to her clipboard. "It's rare, but it does happen. We can arrange for a follow-up test next week." Ted nodded, though he barely heard her. His mind was already racing down some abyss, a dark place he'd never gone to. He pictured Melissa, her soft smile, her habit of humming old songs while she cooked dinner. Melissa, who'd always been there, who knew him better than he knew himself. Melissa who'd, what, lied to him? No, that was impossible. Not his Melissa. He walked out of the office, clutching the referral for a second test. The street greeted him with a cold wind, but Ted barely noticed his coat flapping in the wind. He walked to the car, not looking around, and the same question kept playing in his head like a broken record. If he was sterile, then whose children were his? That evening, he sat at dinner, looking out at his family. Brad was telling a story about his new job. Mary was teasing him about his beard being too long, and William was glued to his phone as usual. Melissa was sitting across from him, stirring her tea, and her eyes met Ted's. She smiled that warm, familiar smile that always made his heart skip a beat. But now he saw something else in it. A shadow, a secret, or was it just his imagination? "Ted, are you okay?" she asked, her voice as soft as ever. "You've been so quiet all day." He forced himself to smile, even though inside he was clenching with fear. "I'm just tired," he lied. "It's been a long day." But when he went to bed that night, next to Melissa, her breathing was even and calm, and his own was ragged, as if he'd been running a marathon. He looked at the ceiling, and in the darkness, his children's faces appeared before his eyes. Their features, their laughter, their habits. He looked for himself in them, his eyes, his jaw, the way he spoke. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure he'd found anything. Ted Miller sat in the same office he had been in a week ago, but now everything seemed foreign. The sterile smell of antiseptic cut into his nose, and the fluorescent lights seemed too bright, almost blinding. He watched Dr. Wellner leaf through a thin folder, her fingers moving with the same mechanical precision as last time. Ted felt his heart pounding, as if it were trying to break through his rib cage. He had been up most of the night imagining this moment, running through every possible scenario in his head. A lab error, a mix-up in the paperwork, even the ridiculous idea that someone had switched his tests. But now, sitting across from the doctor, he knew that any hope of error was fading with each passing second. "Mr. Miller," Wellner began, her voice calm but still carrying the same caution she'd used when they first met. She set the folder down and looked him straight in the eye. "I've received the results of your follow-up tests. Unfortunately, they confirm the original diagnosis. You have congenital infertility. The condition has likely been present since birth. I've reviewed your medical records, and there are records dating back to your adolescence. This isn't new information, it's just that no one has apparently discussed it with you directly." Ted felt the blood drain from his face. His fingers dug into the arms of his chair, the wood creaking under his grip. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat like a lump of wet clay. Congenital sterility, since birth, which meant that all these years, he swallowed, trying to regain control of his voice. "Records," he finally managed. "What records? No one has ever told me anything like that. I would know. I will remember." Dr. Wellner frowned slightly, her brows drawing together, but her expression remaining professionally neutral. She opened the folder and pulled out several sheets of paper, covered in small print and medical jargon that Ted didn't even try to understand. "Here," she said, handing him one of the sheets. "These are the results of a test you had when you were 17. It revealed azoospermia no sperm. It's not something you usually discuss with a teenager unless there are obvious complaints. Perhaps your doctor decided it wasn't urgent, or you just didn't remember. It happens." Ted stared at the paper, but the letters blurred before his eyes. All he could see was the date 31 years ago and his name typed in the top corner. His hands were shaking, and he set the paper down on the table, afraid it would slip from his fingers. "But," he began, his voice shaking like a boy who's just been told his world is a lie. "I have 3 children. Brad, Mary, William. They're mine. I was there when they were born. I held them. I raised them. They're my children." Wellner was silent, her eyes searching for him, and in that silence Ted felt something worse than pity, understanding. She knew what he was going through, but there was nothing she could do to soften the blow. "I know this is hard," she said finally. "It's a shock, and I can't answer all your questions. But medically," she hesitated, searching for the words. "Medically, you couldn't be the biological father. Maybe you should talk to your wife, or someone who can help you figure this out." "Talk to Melissa," Ted almost laughed, but it came out harsh, almost hysterical. "Are you serious? Tell her, 'Hey, honey, the doctor says I couldn't have fathered our kids, so maybe you could explain? Is that what you mean?'" Wellner didn't look away, but her fingers tightened slightly on the pen she held. "I'm not saying it will be easy," she replied, "but it's better to address these issues openly. There may be an explanation. Artificial insemination, donation, it's not uncommon, and it doesn't necessarily mean something bad. Bad? Ted raised his voice, and his words echoed off the walls of the office. You call that not necessarily bad? My life is a lie. My children, he trailed off, choking on anger and pain. His eyes burned, but he wouldn't let himself cry. Not here. Not in front of this woman with her cold professionalism. Mr. Miller, Wellner said quietly, I understand how you're feeling. I can recommend a therapist if you'd like. Sometimes it's easier to deal with news like this if you have support. A psychologist? Ted shook his head, his lips twisting into a bitter smile. You think I want to talk about this with a stranger? I don't even know how to talk about it with myself. He stood up, feeling the floor beneath his feet sway like the deck of a ship in a storm. His coat was hanging over the back of his chair, but he didn't pick it up. He just wanted to leave, right now, away from this office, from this woman, from these papers that had turned his world upside down. Thank you for everything, he muttered, not looking at her, and headed for the door. Mr. Miller, Wellner called, and for the first time there was real warmth in her voice. Please consider getting another test. For your peace of mind, and if you need to talk, my door is open. Ted didn't answer. He stepped out into the hallway, and the door closed behind him with a soft click. The world around him seemed blurry, as if someone had erased all the colors, leaving only gray shadows. He walked through the hospital lobby, past people rushing about their business, unaware that his life had just shattered into pieces. He was shaking, not from the cold, but from something deep within him, like a poison that poisoned his every thought. His hands were still shaking as he got into the car. He stared at his fingers on the steering wheel and tried to remember what Brad looked like when he laughed, how Mary rolled her eyes when he made jokes, how William sang his stupid songs. They were his kids. Hi. But now every image of them in his mind felt fake, like a photograph that someone had airbrushed to fool him. He didn't drive home. Instead, he pulled into the empty parking lot of the supermarket where he and Melissa usually shopped for groceries on Saturdays. He sat in the car, looking at the empty shopping carts scattered across the pavement, and tried to figure out what to do next. Should he tell Melissa? Ask her? But how? How to ask the question that could destroy everything they'd spent 26 years building? What if she'd lied to him? What if she knew? His mind clung to the thought, and it burned like a hot coal. Ted pulled out his phone and pulled up a family photo from last summer at the lake. Brad, Mary, William, Melissa, all smiling, and he standing behind them, his arm around his wife's shoulders. He stared at the photo, trying to find something of himself in the children's faces. His nose, his chin, but the longer he looked, the more he saw Melissa in them, her eyes, her smile. And then, like lightning, another face popped into his head. Peter Drake, an old friend of the family. The Peter who had always been there, who had joked with Melissa in a way Ted never could. The Peter who had once, years ago, held her hand in his hand too long as they were saying goodbye after dinner. No, he said out loud, his voice shaking in the emptiness of the car. This is crazy. This can't be. But the thought was already ingrained, and he couldn't shake it. He remembered the way Peter had looked at Mary when she was little, the way he'd called her his little princess. It had seemed innocent then. Not anymore. Ted came home late. Melissa was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book. She looked up as he entered, and her usual smile lit up her face. "Darling, where have you been?" she asked, putting the book down. "I called, but you didn't answer." "Just late," he said, trying to keep his voice even. He didn't look her in the eyes, afraid she'd see his fear, his doubts. "Work." "You look tired," she said, standing up and coming toward him. Her hand touched his shoulder, and Ted tensed involuntarily. "Would you like some tea? Or would you like something to eat? I left you some lasagna." "No, I'm fine," he muttered, moving toward the stairs. "I just want to lie down." Melissa looked at him with a little concern, but said nothing. She always knew when he was in a bad mood, and usually gave him space. But today, her silence didn't seem like concern to him, but something else. A secret, a mystery. That night, he didn't sleep again. He lay next to Melissa, listening to her even breathing, and thought about how to ask her, how to bring up the subject that could ruin everything. He imagined her reaction: tears, anger, denial, or worse, a confession. He thought about Peter, about Nora, Melissa's friend who always knew more than she let on. He thought about his children who might never have been his. And with each new thought, his heart squeezed tighter until he felt like it was going to burst. "Melissa," he whispered into the darkness, so quietly she couldn't hear. "Who are they? Who is their father?" But there was no answer, only silence, heavy as a gravestone. Ted Miller stood in the middle of the attic of his house, surrounded by dusty boxes that now seemed to him not just a repository of old things, but a real labyrinth of secrets, where each object could become a key to the solution, or, on the contrary, further entangle him in the web of doubts that had entangled his mind since the moment Dr. Wellner said those words that turned his life upside down. Sunlight penetrated through a small window under the roof, casting long shadows on the floor covered with a layer of dust, and Ted felt how this dust settled not only on his clothes, but also on his soul, making every movement heavy, as if he were dragging behind him the invisible weight of all those years that he had lived in blissful ignorance. He had not slept for the third night in a row, his eyes were red from lack of sleep, and his thoughts were spinning in a whirlwind of what-ifs that did not give him peace, forcing him to return again and again to that phrase, "You could not be the biological father." What if it was true? What if his children Brad, Mary, and William weren't really his? The thought burned inside him like acid, eating away at everything he believed in, everything that formed the basis of his existence as a husband and a father. He started with the photographs, the old albums Melissa had painstakingly collected over the years, carefully pasted into pages with colorful borders and captions in her neat handwriting, which always reminded Ted of her schoolteacher meticulousness. The first box he pulled out of the corner was labeled Family Photos 1990s, and when he opened it, a wave of nostalgia mixed with pain hit him so hard that he had to sit down on an old chair that creaked under his weight. There was a picture of their wedding, him in a tuxedo, a goofy grin on his face, and Melissa in a white dress, her eyes shining with happiness, and Peter Drake standing there like best man, his hand on Ted's shoulder, but the gesture seemed possessive to Ted now, not friendly, as if Peter had already known something Ted didn't. He flipped through the pages, searching for his features in the children's faces: his straight nose, his brown eyes, the way he smiled with a slight asymmetry, one cheek rising higher than the other. Brad in the photo at age 5, dark hair like Melissa's, but his eyes. His eyes were blue, like Peter's, the Peter who always joked that his Irish ancestors had brought the color into the family. Ted shook his head, trying to push the thought away, but it came back like a boomerang, more insistent than ever. "It's a coincidence," he whispered to himself, his voice echoing off the attic walls where no one could hear him, except the spiders spinning their webs in the corners. Just a coincidence. Genetics are complicated, maybe from grandma or something. But the more he looked, the less convinced he was. There was Mary as a teenager, with her long legs and the graceful walk that Ted had always thought was his mother's. But now he remembered Peter once saying, "She's growing up to be a real athlete, like me when I was younger," and the remark, innocent at the time, now sounded like a hint, a veiled confession. William in the photo with the guitar, his fingers long and nimble, unlike Ted's, with his short, accountant's hands, used to a computer keyboard rather than a string. Ted closed the album and put it aside, feeling the lump in his throat growing, making it hard to breathe. He stood up and walked over to another box labeled Letters and Papers, which contained old postcards, letters from relatives, and even a few notes from Melissa written during the early years of their marriage. The first letter he came across was from Melissa, dated 1998, when she was pregnant with Brad. "Dear Ted," he read, his fingers shaking as he held the yellowed paper. "I'm so excited that we're expecting our first child. You're going to be a great dad. I know you will. Love you." Nothing out of the ordinary, but somehow the words now felt false, like there was another truth behind them. He dug through the pages, finding cards from Peter. "Congratulations on your new son. He's going to be as strong as his mom and, you know." Ted froze, rereading that phrase. And, you know. What did that mean? A hint? A joke? Or just an awkward way of putting it? His heart was pounding like a drum, and he felt sweat trickling down his back despite the coolness of the attic. He remembered how Peter had always been there for him in those years, helping him move, fixing the car, even taking Melissa to the store when Ted was working late. An old friend of the family, they called him, but now Ted saw something more, something darker, hiding behind the facade of friendship. He spent the entire day in the attic, forgetting about lunch, about the calls from work, about the fact that Melissa could come home at any moment and wonder where he was. As the sun began to set, painting the attic orange, Ted sat on the floor, surrounded by scattered photos and letters, his mind full of what-ifs. What if Melissa had been cheating on him all these years? What if Peter was the real father? What if the kids knew but weren't talking? The thought hit him like a slap in the face, and he imagined Brad looking at him with pity, Mary looking away, William joking to cover up the awkwardness. No, they couldn't know. They were children, innocent in this web of lies. But doubt gnawed at him like a worm on an apple, leaving him empty. He could no longer convince himself of the similarities. They seemed to him far-fetched, artificial, as if all his life he had seen what he wanted to see, and not what was actually there. That evening, when Melissa returned from school, Ted came downstairs, trying to look normal, but his face was pale and his eyes were glassy. She noticed it right away. Her teacher's gaze, accustomed to catching the slightest changes in the mood of her students, could not miss this in her husband. "Ted, what's wrong?" she asked, taking off her coat and hanging it on the rack by the door, her voice full of concern, but to Ted that concern now sounded like a mask hiding the truth. "You look like you haven't slept in a week. Something wrong at work." He forced himself to smile, but it came out crooked and unnatural, like a circus clown hiding his tears behind makeup. "Nothing special," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just reports, end of quarter. How was your day?" Melissa sighed, moving closer and wrapping her arms around his waist, her warm body pressed against his, but Ted felt only cold, as if an invisible wall had grown between them. "An ordinary day," she said, her breath on his neck. "The kids were noisy, as usual. And then Nora called, asked us to have coffee on the weekend. Maybe we could go together. Peter will be there too. He hasn't seen us in a long time." Peter's name struck Ted like an electric shock, and he tensed involuntarily, his muscles stiffening under her hands. "Peter?" he asked, trying to sound neutral, but there was a note of suspicion in his voice that he couldn't hide. "Why is he there? Is Nora his friend or something?" Melissa pulled back, looking at him with mild surprise, her eyebrows raised as if she hadn't expected such a question. "Well, they talk sometimes," she replied, shrugging. "Peter's an old friend. Why are you reacting like that? Is something wrong?" Ted shook his head, walking towards the kitchen where he began pouring water into the kettle, just to keep his hands busy and avoid looking her in the eye. "Nothing," he muttered. "Just tired. Maybe another time." Dinner passed in silence, broken only by the clink of forks and the occasional phrase about the weather or the news that Ted barely heard, his mind far away in those boxes in the attic, in those photos that now burned into his memory. After dinner, he went into his office, supposedly to work, but in reality he sat at the computer, staring at the screen where the page for searching DNA tests was open. He read reviews, articles, forums where people shared their stories similar to his, full of pain and disappointment. "I found out my son wasn't mine after 15 years of marriage," wrote one. "My wife hid the truth about the donor," complained another. Each word echoed in his soul, intensifying the shock, making it real, tangible. The next day, Ted decided to act. He couldn't wait any longer, couldn't live in this limbo where every glance at the children raised doubts, every conversation with Melissa raised suspicions. He remembered Dr. Harris, his old doctor, who had retired but still practiced in a small private clinic for friends and former patients. Harris was someone Ted trusted, grumpy but honest, with a dry humor that always lightened the mood. Ted called him secretly from work, locked in his office, while his colleagues were eating lunch. "Hello, Dr. Harris," Ted said when he answered, his voice low, almost a whisper, as if he was afraid someone would overhear. "Ted Miller." Harris's voice boomed over the phone, still deep despite his age. "Long time no hear. What's up, boy? You're with that young Wellner now. Can't she handle it?" Ted swallowed, searching for words, his fingers gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "No, it's not about her," he replied. "It's personal. I need your help. Secretly. Off the record, off the record." Harris paused, and Ted heard him groan as he settled more comfortably. "That sounds serious," he said at last. "What exactly? Tell me straight. I don't like riddles." Ted took a deep breath, and the words came out like a torrent. He could no longer hold back. "I need to do a DNA paternity test. For all 3 kids. But I don't want anyone to know. Not Melissa, not them. I... I heard from Wellner about infertility. Congenital. And now, I'm not sure." There was a pause, long and heavy, and Ted imagined Harris frowning, his gray eyebrows drawing together. "Damn it, Ted," he said finally, his voice softening. "This is serious. Are you sure you want to dig? Sometimes the truth hurts worse than not knowing." "I'm already hurt, doctor," Ted replied, his voice shaking. "I can't live with this what if. I need to know." Harris sighed, and Ted heard the rustling of papers on the other end. "Okay, come tomorrow night, after 6. I'll set it up at a friend's lab. Take samples from the kid's hair, saliva, whatever. And from yourself, of course. Results in a week. But Ted, think again. This could change everything." "I've already changed," Ted said, hanging up the phone, feeling the adrenaline pumping through his veins. Now comes the hard part, getting samples. Ted planned everything carefully, like an accountant writing a report, neat, error-free. For Brad, who still lived at home, he waited until he had showered and collected a hair from his comb, carefully placing it in a bag. Mary came home from college for the weekend, and Ted accidentally took her glass of tea, wiping away the drool with a cotton swab when no one was looking. William was simpler. His toothbrush provided enough material. Each time, Ted's heart pounded as if he were committing a crime and not just trying to find out the truth about his life. At Harris's clinic, everything went smoothly. The old man met him in a small office that smelled of coffee and old books, and they talked while a lab technician took samples. "Tell me how you got to this point," Harris said, pouring Ted some coffee from a thermos, his eyes as shrewd as in the old days. Ted told him about Wellner, about the tests, about the doubts, about Peter. Harris listened, nodding, not interrupting. "Peter Drake, huh?" he said finally. "I remember him. Always there for you. But Ted, don't jump to conclusions. Maybe it's a donor or something. Melissa's a good woman." "Good," Ted smiled bitterly. "If she lied to me for 26 years, then how good is she?" Harris placed his hand on his shoulder, his palm heavy and fatherly. "Wait for the results. And then decide. But remember, fatherhood isn't just blood. You raised them, Ted. That's important." Ted nodded, but Harris's words did not comfort him. He left the clinic into the night, where the rain pounded the roofs of the cars, and drove home, where Melissa was waiting with dinner and a smile that now seemed like a mask to him. The week of waiting stretched into an eternity, full of sleepless nights and internal monologues in which he rehearsed conversations. "Melissa, why did you lie?" Or, "Kids, I love you, but..." He continued to dig through the archives, finding more details: Melissa's old diary, where she wrote about a secret I can't tell, but it was too vague to be evidence. He even called Nora on the pretext of asking, but she dodged the questions, saying, "Ted, it's all in the past, don't stir it up." When the results came back, Ted met Harris in the park to avoid suspicion. The envelope in his hands felt like a bomb ready to explode. "Open up," Harris said, his voice quiet. Ted tore open the envelope, and the words on the paper hit him. probability of paternity 0% for all three. The world collapsed. Ted sat on the bench, rain dripping onto the paper, smearing the ink, but he already knew. What if was now a reality. Ted Miller stood at the window of his office, looking out at the street where the autumn leaves swirled in the wind, as if trying to carry away all the little worries that usually filled his days. But today nothing could distract him from the weight that settled in his chest like a stone, pressing down on his breath and making his heart beat unevenly, with pauses full of anticipation and fear of what was about to happen. He had been expecting a call from Dr. Harris for days, and each time the phone vibrated in his pocket, his fingers grew cold and his thoughts flew away to the moment when he gave samples, stealthily, like a thief in his own home, collecting hairs and saliva from his children, whom he loved more than life itself. But now that love hung on a thin thread of doubt, ready to break at the slightest breath of truth. When the phone finally rang and Harris's name appeared on the screen, Ted felt the world around him shrinking, the walls of the office closing in, the air growing thick and difficult for his lungs to pass through, and he answered, trying to keep his voice steady, but inside he was shaking like a leaf in the wind. "Ted, it's Harris," the doctor said on the other end of the line, his voice low, with that rasp he'd acquired from years of cigar smoking that he'd given up, but which had lingered, like a reminder of the past, and in his voice Ted heard a note he didn't want to hear, sympathy mixed with professional detachment, as if the doctor already knew what he was going to say and knew how it would hit. "The results are back on the first sample. On Brad. I'm not beating around the bush, man. It's not your biological son. 0% chance. I checked twice. The lab is reliable. There's no way it could be wrong." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, and Ted felt the cold spread through his body, starting from his fingertips, up his arms, into his chest, and down into his stomach, where everything tightened into a tight knot that made him sick, and he leaned on the windowsill to keep from falling, because his legs suddenly felt like cotton wool, and the world before his eyes swam like a fog, where the familiar outlines of houses and trees turned into blurry shadows. Not his. Brad, his firstborn, the boy he had held in the delivery room, feeling the tiny fingers squeeze his finger with unexpected strength, Brad who had learned to walk by holding on to his leg, and whose first word had been "Daddy," spoken with such joy that Ted had cried tears of happiness. This Brad was not his son by blood, and the thought cut to the quick, leaving a wound that bled inside, invisible to others but unbearable to himself. He was silent, unable to force out a word, and Harris must have realized this, because he went on, his tone softening, like a father comforting a son after his first serious failure. "Look, Ted, I know this is a gut punch, but let's not jump to conclusions," the doctor said, and there was an attempt to be supportive in his words, although they both knew that no words would soften this truth that had already pierced the heart like a knife, and was turning there, increasing the pain with each turn. "Maybe it's a mistake in the test tubes or something, although I don't believe it. The lab has checked it. Or hell, maybe there's some explanation you don't know about. Talk to Melissa, but be careful, don't rush into accusations. And the rest of the results will be in a couple of days. Wait for them. Maybe this is an isolated case." Ted nodded, though Harris couldn't see it, and muttered something like, "Thank you, doctor." But his voice was hoarse and alien, as if someone else were speaking, and he was watching from the sidelines, detached, trying to make sense of how his life, as stable and predictable as the balance sheets he'd been preparing for years, had suddenly turned into chaos, where nothing was what it seemed. He hung up and sat down at his desk, staring at the computer screen where the quarterly balance sheet numbers flickered but blurred before his eyes, meaningless in that moment, because everything that mattered was collapsing like a house of cards under a slight push. The pain was sharp, but underneath it there was a glimmer of hope, faint as a candle flame in a storm, that this was a mistake, that the lab had mixed up the samples, or that something in his medical history was not as Wellner thought, and he clung to that hope like a drowning man to a straw, because the alternative was too terrible to admit that his family had been built on a lie, that Melissa, the woman he loved unconditionally, had kept such a secret from him all these years. That evening, driving home, Ted drove slowly, skirting familiar streets where every house, every fence evoked memories of the past, of simpler days when Brad was little and they would build pillow forts together in the living room, laughing until they dropped when Melissa would come in with a tray of cookies, her eyes shining with happiness, and Peter, their neighbor and old friend, would drop in sometimes with toys or just to chat, and Ted hadn't noticed anything suspicious about the way Peter looked at Melissa, with a warmth that had seemed friendly, but now, in the light of this news, that warmth took on a different color, more intimate, more dangerous. He remembered the time when Melissa had been pregnant with Brad, when they had just moved into this neighborhood, when Peter lived across the street, a widower with a charming smile and stories of his travels that fascinated Melissa, and she often invited him to dinner, saying that the poor guy was lonely, and Ted, busy with work, did not object, glad that his wife was not alone. But there were times, those late evenings when Ted came home late and Peter was still sitting at their place, sipping wine, and Melissa laughed at his jokes louder than usual, her hand sometimes touching his shoulder, and Ted had waved it off, thinking it was just friendship, but now these touches seemed like betrayal, a hint of something more that was happening behind his back, and the thought burned like fire, making him grip the steering wheel so hard that his knuckles turned white. Brad met him in the hallway at home, wearing that lazy grin that always made Ted smile back. But today it was forced, because when he looked at his son, no, not his son, Ted reminded himself, and the thought hit him like a blow, he saw features that weren't his own. But something alien, maybe Peter's, the same blue eyes, the same jawline, and the resemblance he hadn't noticed before was now like a thorn digging into his skin. Brad was chattering about his new job, some project that required creativity, and Ted nodded, trying to listen, but the words flew past him like birds, leaving no trace, because a storm of emotions was raging inside him, love mixed with pain and anger, and that stubborn hope that this was all a dream from which he was about to wake up. "Dad, can you hear me?" Brad asked, and that dad cut into his heart because it was true in his soul, but a lie in his blood, and Ted forced himself to concentrate, answering something neutral, but his voice sounded muffled, as if from far away. Melissa was in the kitchen cooking dinner, humming an old tune they had heard when they first met, and Ted stood in the doorway, watching her, her graceful movements, the way she stirred the sauce, and in that moment he loved her as much as he had ever loved her. But that love was poisoned by the suspicion that she had betrayed him, that Brad was the fruit of her intimacy with Peter, and the idea was spinning in his head, gaining momentum, but he stifled it, telling himself that it was impossible, that Melissa was not like that their marriage was solid as a rock, and no amount of testing would change how he felt. But the suspicion was there, lurking in the corner of his mind like a shadow waiting to grow, and Ted went to her, hugged her from behind, feeling her warmth, but inside everything was cold as a winter night, and he kissed her neck, trying to convince himself that nothing had changed. That night, lying in bed, Ted couldn't sleep, his mind flipping through memories like old film reels, showing scenes from the past. Melissa and Peter dancing at their housewarming party, her head on his shoulder, which Ted had thought was sweet, but now saw as an intimacy that made him jealous. Peter helping Melissa with her garden when she was early in her pregnancy, their hands brushing over the flowers and laughter echoing across the yard while Ted worked in his office, unsuspecting. Peter bringing a gift of an engraved silver rattle after Brad was born, his eyes shining with a pride that Ted had taken for friendship, but now wondered. These memories were snowballing, threatening to crush him, but he pushed them away, telling himself that it was paranoia, that the test could be wrong, that Harris had told him to wait for other results, and that hope, however weak, allowed him to breathe, preventing him from drowning in despair. The next day, Ted decided to distract himself with work, immersing himself in numbers and reports, where everything was logical and predictable, unlike his personal life, which had turned into a labyrinth of puzzles. But even there, at the table, his thoughts returned to Brad, to how he grew up, to his first steps, his first words, his first successes at school, and Ted realized that blood or no blood, he was a father in every sense except the biological one, and this thought brought comfort mixed with sadness, because he wanted to be everything to his children, and now he felt cheated. He called Brad under the pretext of asking about work, just to hear his voice, and they talked about small things, about football, about plans for the weekend, and there was nothing unusual in this conversation, but for Ted every word was valuable as gold because it confirmed their connection, which did not depend on DNA. But the suspicion about Peter never went away entirely. It would surface in weak moments, when Ted would see Melissa texting someone on the phone, smiling at the screen, and he would wonder if it was Peter, or when she would mention Nora, the friend who knew all the secrets, and Ted would consider sharing his doubts with her, but he would push the idea away, afraid that she would tell Melissa and everything would explode prematurely. He decided to wait for the rest of the results, hoping that they would disprove the first one, that Mary and William would be his, and then perhaps there would be an explanation for Brad, a donation or something, and this hope supported him like a crutch to a lame man, allowing him to move forward step by step in this new, frightening world. That evening, he and Melissa went for a walk, holding hands, the wind in her hair, and she talked about school, about students who reminded her of their children when they were little, and Ted listened, nodding, but inside he was fighting the urge to ask her directly, to spill everything that had been building up. But he held back because he loved her, and he was afraid of losing her, and this internal struggle made every moment tense, like a taut string about to snap. When they returned, Brad was home, playing a video game, and he invited Ted to join him, and they sat shoulder to shoulder, laughing over virtual adventures, and in that moment the pain retreated, leaving a warmth of fatherhood that no one could take away. But at night the doubts returned, and Ted lay staring at the ceiling where the shadows from the street lamp danced like ghosts of the past, and he thought about the future, about how to tell the children if everything turned out to be true, how to keep the family together, and the uncertainty tormented him, but he silenced the suspicions, focusing on the love that was real, tangible, and that helped him get through another day. Ted Miller sat in his car in the parking lot where Dr. Harris handed him the second envelope of DNA results, his fingers shaking like a man clutching a live wire as he clutched the paper as if it were the last thread tying him to a reality that was already crumbling under the weight of a truth so heavy and relentless that he could feel it crushing his bones, his soul, his past, turning everything he knew about himself into dust that settled on his tongue like the bitter taste of betrayal. He hesitated before opening the envelope because after Brad, after he'd learned that his firstborn wasn't his by blood, there had still been a spark of hope in him, faint but stubborn as a flame in a storm, that Mary and William, his youngest children, would be his, that some part of his family would remain untouched by this awful truth that Dr. Wellner had so casually dropped into his life like a grenade into a foxhole. But when he tore open the envelope, his eyes scanned the lines, and the words, probability of paternity, 0% for Mary and William hit him like a hammer, shattering the last pillar of faith he had in his life. All three of them. Not one of his children, Brad, Mary, William, was his biological son or daughter. He sat staring at the paper, and the world around him became colorless, like an old photograph faded with time, and the sounds, the wind, the honking of cars, the distant laughter of children on the playground merged into a low, oppressive hum, as if he were sinking underwater, where there was no air, no escape. Ted didn't remember the drive home. The road had dissolved into a fog of thoughts, where every turn was a question, every traffic light an accusation. How? Why? When? He pictured Melissa, her soft smile, her habit of tucking her hair behind her ear, her voice when she sang lullabies to the children, and it all seemed like theater now, a carefully constructed set behind which lurked another woman, one who had lied to him, who had carried other people's children and passed them off as his, who had built their marriage on a foundation of deceit. He walked into the house, silent as a ghost, and went straight to the basement, where he kept an old box of bottles of whiskey, gifts to him on various occasions, but never opened because Ted didn't drink he hadn't drunk in 20 years, not since Melissa had gotten pregnant with Brad, and he had decided to be a good father, sober, reliable, always ready for late-night trips to the hospital or early morning strolls with the stroller. But he wasn't a father today. He wasn't being what he had always thought he was. He pulled out the bottle, dusty, with a gold label, and poured himself a full glass, straight, without adding ice, just wanting to drown the pain that was tearing at him from the inside, like an animal tearing at its cage. The first glass burned his throat, but he drank again and again until the glass was empty, and then he poured himself another, sitting on the old sofa in the basement that smelled damp and abandoned, and each sip was a blow he dealt himself, punishing himself for not seeing the truth, for believing, for loving so blindly. He thought of Mary, her serious eyes when she read her philosophy books, her habit of arguing politics with him over dinner, her laugh so loud it carried through the house, and now every image of her was stained, as if someone had spilled ink on her portrait, and he could not find himself in her, though he searched, desperately searched, for some hint of his own in her features. William, his younger self, with his guitar, with his dreams of being a musician, with his easy smile that always made Ted feel younger, was a stranger too, and the thought was unbearable because William had been his shadow, his reflection in his youth, or so he thought. But now he saw in him only alien features, perhaps Peter's, the same Peter whose face kept popping up in his mind more and more often, like a ghost haunting him. "Peter," Ted whispered into the empty basement, his voice rough and slick with whiskey and pain. He remembered Peter being there when Mary was born, bringing a huge bouquet of roses to the hospital, holding Melissa for too long, too close, and Ted had dismissed it as just a friendly gesture. But now every moment felt like evidence, proof of a betrayal that had been going on for years. And William? Peter had been there then, helping her move into a new house when Melissa was 7 months pregnant, and Ted, consumed by work, had left her with him, trusting her like a fool, like a blind man who couldn't see the abyss before him. He drank some more, and the whiskey no longer burned, but simply flowed down his throat like water, bringing no relief, but dulling the sharpness of the pain, making it dull and aching, like an old wound in rainy weather. Ted didn't remember how he got to the bedroom, but when he woke up the next morning, his head was pounding and his mouth tasted like ash, and he was lying on his bed in clothes that smelled like sweat and whiskey, and Melissa had already left for work, leaving a note on the nightstand. "Ted, you were weird last night. Is everything okay? Call if you need to talk. Love." Those words, love, cut him like a knife, because the love he knew was now in question, and he didn't know how to trust it, how to trust anything. He stood up unsteadily and went to the bathroom, where the cold water he splashed on his face did nothing to wash away the hangover or the horror that washed over him when he looked in the mirror and saw not himself, but someone else, with red eyes, with wrinkles he hadn't noticed before, with an expression on his face that screamed loss, the collapse of everything he thought was his. And then the panic attack began. It came on him suddenly, like a predator swooping down from an ambush. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst through his ribcage. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, as if someone was squeezing his throat, and the walls of the bathroom began to close in, threatening to crush him. He grabbed the sink, trying to breathe, but there was no air, and the only question that kept running through his head was, who am I? His entire life, 26 years of marriage, 3 children, the home he and Melissa had built together had been an illusion, a mirage he had mistaken for reality, and now that mirage had dissipated, leaving him in a desert of nothing but his own despair. He sank to the floor, hugging his knees to his chest, and tried to breathe, counting in his head, the way a therapist had taught him years ago when he was struggling with anxiety after his father's death. Inhale 1, 2, 3, 4. Outhale 1, 2, 3, 4. But the numbers didn't help because they couldn't bring back his children, his family, or himself. "This can't be true," he whispered, his voice shaking like a child lost in a crowd. "This is a mistake. They're mine. They should be mine." But the results were inexorable, and he knew it. He remembered looking at Mary when she came over for the weekend, her serious eyes, her habit of fiddling with the pendant around her neck when she was nervous, and how he'd looked for himself in her, but found only Melissa, her cheekbones, her way of speaking, and now he realized he'd been looking in the wrong place, that Mary might have been a little like Peter or someone else he didn't even know. William, his youngest, with his dreamy nature, with his guitar that he carried everywhere, Ted had always thought it was his rebellious spirit, inherited from his grandfather, but now he saw something alien in it, as if William were a reflection of another man whose shadow hung over their family. He remembered Peter once saying, looking at William, "This guy will go far, he has the soul of an artist," and Ted had taken it as a compliment then, but now it sounded like a hint, like a confession that Peter did not dare to make openly. Ted rose from the floor as the attack began to recede, leaving him weak, exhausted, but with one thing clear: he had to know the truth. Not just about DNA, but about what had been going on behind his back, about who Peter Drake really was, about what Melissa knew and why she hadn't told him. He couldn't ask her directly, not now, not while his emotions were like exposed wires, sparking and dangerous. Instead, he decided to start with Nora, Melissa's friend, who had always been there, who had always known more than she'd let on, and whose evasive answers in their last conversation had only fueled his suspicions. He called Nora at lunchtime, sitting in his office at work where no one could overhear, and his voice was as calm as possible, even though inside he was seething. "Nora, it's Ted," he began, trying to sound casual, but his fingers were fiddling nervously with his pen, leaving scratches on the paper. "I want to meet up, talk about old times. You know how Melissa likes to reminisce about the past." Nora paused, and in that pause Ted heard tension, as if she were weighing every word. "Sure, Ted," she finally answered, her voice warm but just a little wary. "When would be convenient for you? I'm free on Saturday." "Great," he said, feeling his pulse quicken. "How about the cafe on the corner where we used to meet, at 2 o'clock?" "Deal," Nora said, and Ted heard her smile through the phone, but it seemed fake, like a plastic mask. "But Ted, is everything okay? You sound, I don't know, tense." "It's okay," he lied, and the lie came easy because he was already used to hiding his feelings, his fears, his pain. "I just want to chat." When he hung up, his thoughts went back to Melissa, to her smile, to her arms around him, to her voice that said, "I love you," and he didn't know how to reconcile this woman with someone who could hide such a secret. He didn't know how to go on living, knowing that his children weren't his, that his life was an illusion, carefully constructed so that he would never suspect the truth. But he knew one thing: he wouldn't stop until he knew everything, even if that truth destroyed him completely. Saturday morning greeted Ted Miller with a gray sky hanging low over the city, as if to reflect the weight of his thoughts, which, like leaden clouds, did not allow a single ray of hope to break through. He stood at the living room window, holding a mug of cold coffee, and looked out onto the street where the neighbors' children rode their bikes, their laughter cutting into his ears, reminding him of the days when Brad and Mary and William had been just as carefree, and he, Ted, had been their hero, their father, their rock. Now that rock had collapsed, and he felt like he was standing on the edge of an abyss where every step could be his last. Today he was supposed to meet Nora, and the thought filled him with both fear and determination: fear that she would confirm his worst suspicions, and determination that he would not back down until he uncovered the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Ted dressed carefully, choosing the shirt and jacket he usually wore to important meetings, as if looking neat might give him a confidence he didn't feel. He glanced at himself in the mirror before leaving. His face was drawn, there were dark circles under his eyes, and there was an emptiness in his eyes that he couldn't hide even with a forced smile. Melissa had gone to a school meeting, and the house was empty, but the silence was not comforting, but oppressive, as if the walls knew his secret and were silent, mocking his ignorance. He took his keys and left, trying not to think about what awaited him in the cafe, but his thoughts kept returning to Nora, to her evasive answers, to her way of looking slightly to the side when the conversation turned to the past. The corner cafe was small, with worn wooden tables and the smell of freshly brewed coffee that mingled with the aroma of baked goods to create the illusion of coziness, but to Ted it was as deceptive as everything else in his life now. He arrived early, took a table by the window, and ordered a black coffee, though he knew he wouldn't drink it, his stomach already in a tight knot. Nora arrived promptly at 2, her red hair pulled back into a messy bun, her smile as warm as ever, but with that slightly wary edge that Ted now noticed in everything about his family. "Ted, it's good to see you," she said, sitting down across from him and taking off her coat. Her voice was soft, but there was a wariness to it, like someone who knew the conversation might turn into a minefield. "You haven't called in a while. Is everything okay?" Ted forced himself to smile, though his lips trembled with effort. He folded his hands on the table to hide the way they were shaking and looked into her eyes, trying to find the truth she might be hiding. "Yeah, it's okay," he lied, and the lie came easier than he expected, because he was already used to hiding his feelings behind a facade of calm. "I just wanted to talk. About old times, you know. When we first moved here, when the kids were little." Nora nodded, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her napkin, and Ted saw her gaze flicker to the side for a moment, as if she were looking for somewhere to hide from his questions. "Oh yeah, those were good times," she said, her voice rising slightly as if she were trying to fill the silence. "Remember when we'd all gather in your backyard? Peter grilling steaks, Melissa making her famous lemonade, and the kids running around like crazy." Peter's name hit Ted like an electric shock, and he felt his jaw tighten. He leaned a little closer, trying to keep his voice level, but there was already a steeliness to it. "Yes, Peter," he said, watching her reaction carefully. "He was always there, wasn't he? Especially when Melissa was pregnant. Helped with the garden, with the move, with the kids. A very loyal friend." Nora froze, her fingers hovering over the napkin, and Ted saw her eyes widen for a split second before she smiled again. But the smile was taut, like a string about to snap. "Well, you know, he was lonely," she said, her voice a little too quick, as if she wanted to change the subject. "A widower, no family. We all tried to support him. Especially Melissa, she's such a kind soul." "A kind soul," Ted repeated, and there was a bitterness in his tone that he could not hide. "Too kind, perhaps. Nora, tell me honestly, was there something between her and Peter back then?" The question hung in the air like a knife poised above the table, and Ted saw Nora turn pale, her fingers gripping her napkin so tightly that it began to tear. She opened her mouth to answer, but paused, as if searching for words, and that pause was more eloquent than any words could have been. "Ted," she began finally, her voice quiet, almost pleading. "Don't dwell on the past. It won't change anything. You and Melissa, you've created such a wonderful family. Brad, Mary, William, they're your children, and that's what matters." "My children?" Ted raised his voice, and several of the customers turned, but he didn't care. He leaned even closer, his eyes burning like coals, and he felt the anger and despair escaping. "What if I told you they weren't mine? That I knew for sure? What then, Nora? What would you tell me?" Nora drew back, her face white as chalk, and looked at him as if he were a man who had just confessed to murder. Her lips trembled, but she did not answer, only shook her head, as if she refused to believe what he had said. "Ted, I don't know what you're talking about," she murmured, but her voice was weak, and Ted realized that she knew more than she was saying, that she had probably known all along, and her silence was another betrayal, another wall separating him from the truth. "Don't lie to me, Nora," he said, his voice low, almost threatening. "I know you know. You were there, you saw them together, Peter and Melissa. Tell me the truth. I deserve this." Nora swallowed, her eyes shining with tears, and she looked away, looking out the window where the rain had begun to drizzle, leaving small droplets on the glass. "Ted, I can't," she whispered. "It's none of my business. If you want to know, talk to Melissa. She's the only one who can explain it to you." "Explain?" Ted almost laughed, but it was bitter as poison. "Explain why she lied to me for 26 years? Why did she give birth to 3 children who weren't mine and didn't even think to tell me? Is that what you're asking me to do?" Nora was silent, her hands shaking, and Ted knew there was no point in pressing any further. She wouldn't say anything he wanted to hear, but her silence, her evasiveness, was already an answer, a confirmation that his worst fears weren't just fantasies, but a reality he'd refused to face for so long. He stood up, throwing a few dollars on the table for the coffee he'd never drunk, and looked at Nora one last time. "Thank you for your honesty," he said with a sarcasm that cut into him, and stepped out into the rain, feeling the drops mingle with his own tears, which he could no longer hold back. At home, he found Melissa in the kitchen, cooking dinner, humming softly, and her serenity, her calm, was like a punch in the face. He looked at her familiar movements, at her warm smile when she turned and noticed him, and he wanted to scream, to ask, to accuse, but the words stuck in his throat because he still loved her, despite everything, and that love was his greatest curse. "Ted, you're wet," she said, coming up to him with a towel. "Where have you been? I was worried." "Just taking a walk," he replied, looking away because her eyes, so familiar, so dear, now seemed alien to him, as if they belonged to another woman, the one who had worn the mask all these years. "I need to take a shower." He went upstairs, leaving her bewildered, and under the hot water, he tried to wash away not only the rain, but the pain that had eaten into him like rust. He knew the next step was to talk to Melissa, but he wasn't ready, wasn't sure he could handle the truth if she confirmed that Peter was the father of his children, that their marriage had been a lie, that everything he thought was his belonged to someone else. But he couldn't stop. The truth, whatever it was the only thing that could give him clarity, even if that clarity destroyed him. The rain pounded the rooftops with a rhythm that seemed to Ted Miller to mock his inner turmoil, as if nature itself were playing along with the chaos that was tearing his soul apart. He sat in his car in front of the cafe where he was supposed to meet Nora, his fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of his jacket sleeve, as if trying to cling to something real, something tangible, in a world that now seemed as elusive as a mirage in the desert. Yesterday's conversation with Nora on the phone had left him with the feeling that she was hiding something, that her warm tone and evasive phrases were only a thin veil behind which hid a truth that could either free him or finish him off completely. He got out of the car, turning up the collar of his coat against the cold wind, and headed toward the cafe, feeling that every step brought him closer to the abyss into which he was afraid to look, but could not stop. The cafe was almost empty, with only a couple of customers sitting in the corner, deep in conversation, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of wet clothes carried in from the street. Ted took the same table by the window as last time, although now the place seemed to him not cozy, but ominous, like a stage where something irreparable was about to play out. He ordered tea just to keep his hands busy, but did not even touch the cup when the waitress brought it. Nora came in a few minutes later, her red hair damp from the rain, and her face a little paler than usual, as if she, too, had a premonition that this conversation would not be easy. She smiled, but the smile was taut, like a string ready to snap at the slightest pressure. "Ted, you're here," she said, taking off her coat and sitting down across from him. Her voice was warm, but there was a wariness to it, like someone walking on thin ice. "Sorry, the rain is holding up traffic. How are you? You look tired." Ted nodded, his lips curling into a faint smile, but his eyes, red from lack of sleep and last night's whiskey, gave him away. He had decided not to waste time on idle conversation, because every minute in this cafe seemed like an eternity, full of tension that squeezed his chest like a vice. "I'm fine, Nora," he said, trying to keep his voice even though he was seething inside. "I just wanted to talk about the past. You know, about when we were just starting out, when the kids were little. You've been with us almost from the beginning, haven't you?" Nora nodded, her fingers fiddling with the edge of the tablecloth, and Ted noticed that her nails, usually neatly painted, were chewed, which was unusual for her. She looked up at him, her green eyes searching his face for something, perhaps a hint that he knew, or perhaps a way to avoid a conversation she clearly didn't want to have. "Yeah, those were the good years," she said, her voice soft but slightly shaky. "Remember those picnics we used to have by the lake? Brad is always jumping in the water and Melissa is screaming at him not to drown. And William, he was such a little thing. He used to sleep in your arms all the time." Ted felt his throat tighten at the mention of children, and images of the past Brad running through the grass, Mary building sandcastles, William pressed against his chest flashed through his mind, so vivid and so painful that he resisted the urge to close his eyes to block them out. He leaned a little closer, his voice lower, almost a whisper, as if he were afraid the walls would overhear. "Nora," he said, his tone firm despite the storm inside him. I don't just want to talk about the good stuff. I want to know the truth about Melissa, about Peter, about what happened when I was at work, when I trusted her, when I trusted him. You know something, I can see it. Don't lie to me. Nora froze, her fingers stopping fiddling with the tablecloth, and looked up at him, her eyes wide like a deer caught in headlights. She opened her mouth to speak, but then closed it again, as if the words she was about to say would destroy everything around her. Ted didn't back down, his gaze hard and piercing, and he could feel the anger and despair rising in him like a wave that was about to overwhelm them both. "Ted, please," she began, her voice shaking as she looked away, staring at the cup of coffee the waitress had just brought. "Don't dredge up the past. It won't help anyone. You and Melissa, you're happy, aren't you? Why dwell on what was?" Happy? Ted almost laughed, but it came out sharp, like the sound of ripping paper. "Do you think I can be happy knowing that my children aren't mine? That Melissa has lied to me all my life? I know Nora. I've had tests done. Brad, Mary, William, none of them are mine. And I want to know why. Who's their father? Peter? Someone else?" Nora turned pale, her hands clenched into fists, and Ted saw tears glistening in her eyes. But she wasn't crying. She was just looking at him like he was the man who had just shattered her world, even though it was his world that was in ruins. She took a deep breath, as if gathering her strength, and finally spoke, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. "Ted, I didn't want you to find out like this," she said, and her words were like a knife piercing his heart. "Melissa, she suspected that you might have a problem with, you know, before Brad. She went to the doctor when you were trying to have a baby. They told her it might be you, but she didn't want to tell you. She didn't want to hurt you." Ted felt the blood drain from his face, and his hands began to shake despite his best efforts to keep himself under control. He looked at Nora, not believing his ears, but her words were too clear, too real to be a lie. "She knew?" he asked, his voice hoarse, as if someone had ripped all the strength out of him. "She knew I was sterile and didn't say anything. Just, what? Decided to find someone else." Nora shook her head, her eyes full of pain, but she did not look away, as if she had finally decided to tell the truth that she had kept to herself for so long. "It wasn't like that, Ted," she said, her voice a little firmer. "She loved you. She does. But, yeah, there was an affair. With Peter. It started when she was pregnant with Brad. She was scared, confused, you were at work all the time, and Peter, he was there. It didn't last long, but—" She paused, her lips trembling, and she pressed them together, as if afraid she'd said too much. "Not for long." Ted leaned closer, his voice almost menacing. "And Mary? And William? Are you saying it was all Peter? Or were there others?" Nora closed her eyes as if she couldn't bear his gaze, and her voice became barely audible. "I don't know, Ted," she whispered. "After Brad, she cut things off with Peter, I swear. But Mary and William, she never told me anything specific. I just know she wanted kids, she wanted a family with you, and maybe she did what she thought was right. Maybe there was a donor, maybe someone else. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know." Ted sat back in his chair, feeling his world crumble even more, if that was even possible. Melissa knew. She knew about his infertility, knew he couldn't be a father, and she'd still given birth to 3 children, letting him believe they were his, letting him raise them, love them, build a life around them. And Peter wasn't just a friend, he was part of her secret, part of her betrayal. And now Nora, her best friend, sat in front of him, confirming the worst, but leaving him with more questions than answers. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked, his voice full of pain, but there was no anger in it, only the weariness of a man who had carried too much weight for too long. "You saw me living this lie. Why didn't you tell me?" Nora looked up at him with tear-filled eyes, and her voice trembled. "Because I saw how much you loved them," she said. "Brad, Mary, William. You were their father, Ted, in every way except biology. And Melissa, she didn't want to lose you. She was afraid the truth would ruin everything. I couldn't give it up. I couldn't ruin your family." "Destroy?" Ted smiled bitterly. his eyes stinging with tears he refused to let out. "She's already destroyed, Nora, and you helped her do it." He stood up without looking at her and threw a few dollars on the table, as if that gesture could put an end to the conversation that had torn his heart to pieces. The rain had picked up as he stepped outside, and he didn't bother turning up his collar, letting the water run down his face, mixing with the tears he could no longer hold back. He walked to the car, not feeling the cold, not hearing the sounds of the city, only repeating Nora's words in his mind. She knew there was an affair, maybe more. Each step was like a hammer blow, driving the truth deeper into his consciousness. And he knew that the next step was the conversation with Melissa, the conversation he dreaded more than anything in the world, because it could be the end of everything he had ever known. Ted Miller sat at the kitchen table, his fingers wrapped around a cold ceramic mug, though the tea he had poured an hour ago was long gone and coated in a thin film, like his own thoughts stuck, murky, unable to move forward. The kitchen, usually warm and filled with the smells of dinner, seemed sterile today, almost alien, with its scrubbed countertops and the dim light of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Melissa stood at the stove, stirring something in a pot, her movements mechanical, as if she were trying to fill the silence that hung between them, heavy as a tombstone. Ted looked at her back, at her familiar silhouette, at the way her hair, slightly touched by gray, fell around her shoulders, and felt love and anger, pain and a thirst for the truth, which was now the only thing that could either save him or destroy him completely, fighting inside him. The conversation with Nora, her evasive words, her confession about Melissa's affair with Peter and Melissa's knowledge of his infertility still burned like a hot coal, and he knew he couldn't wait any longer. Today, now. He took a deep breath, gathering up the last of his courage, and his voice when he spoke was quiet but firm, as if he were pronouncing a sentence. "Melissa," he said, and she froze, her hand holding the spoon in midair. "Please sit down. We need to talk." She turned, her face calm but her eyes flickering with worry, like the shadow of a cloud running across the water. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked slowly to the table and sat down opposite him, her fingers fiddling nervously with the edge of the tablecloth, as if searching for support. "Ted, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft but wary. "You haven't been yourself all day. Is it about work or something else?" Ted looked at her familiar features, at her eyes that he loved more than anything in the world, and he felt his heart clench in pain because those eyes had probably been lying to him for 26 years. He swallowed, trying to hold back the emotions that threatened to burst forth, and asked the question that had been burning inside him since he opened the first envelope of DNA results. "Whose are they?" he asked, his voice flat, almost colorless, but each word carried a heaviness, as if he were throwing stones into an abyss. "Brad, Mary, William. Whose are they, Melissa?" She froze, her eyes wide, and for a moment Ted thought she stopped breathing. The silence that followed his question was deathly, broken only by the soft hiss of the gas under the pan, and that silence was worse than a scream, worse than an accusation, because it confirmed everything he had feared. Melissa looked down, her fingers gripping the tablecloth so tightly her knuckles were white, and Ted saw her lips tremble as if she were trying to find the words, but they were slipping through her fingers like sand. "Ted," she began, her voice as soft as a whisper on the wind, "what are you talking about? They're ours, our children." He shook his head, his eyes never leaving her face, and he felt the anger he had been holding back for so long begin to rise like a wave ready to overwhelm everything around him. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice louder but still under control, even though he was screaming inside. "I know, Melissa. I did the tests. DNA. Brad, Mary, William, none of them are mine. I'm sterile, and you knew it. Nora told me. So whose are they? Peter's? Someone else's?" Melissa flinched as if he had struck her, and her eyes filled with tears that immediately ran down her cheeks, leaving shiny tracks. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shook, and Ted heard her sobbing, quietly, but in such a way that each sound cut him like a knife, because he still loved her, despite everything, and her tears were both pain and punishment for him. "Ted, I didn't want you to know, she whispered, her voice breaking like thin ice. I didn't want to hurt you. You were such a good husband, such a good father. I couldn't tell you. Say what? Ted leaned forward, his voice sharpening, and he felt his hands shaking around his mug. That you cheated on me, that you had children with another man or men, and let me believe they were mine. 26 years, Melissa. 26 years I lived a lie, and you said nothing. She raised her head, her eyes red from tears, but there was not only pain in them, but something else too, determination, as if she had finally decided to tell the truth that she had hidden for so long. I knew, she said, her voice shaking but firm. I knew you couldn't have kids, even before Brad. We tried for 2 years and nothing worked. I went to the doctor and he said the problem was probably you. I wanted to tell you, I swear, but you were so happy, so eager to have a family. I couldn't take that dream away from you. Ted felt his heart squeeze as if someone was squeezing it in a fist, and he looked at her, not believing his ears, not believing that the woman he loved could do this to him. So what did you do? He asked, his voice hoarse, almost alien. Decided to find someone else. Peter, it was him, wasn't it? I saw how close you were. All those dinners, those walks, those friendly hugs of his. Is he Brad's father? Mary's? William's? Melissa shook her head, her tears falling onto the table, leaving dark stains on the tablecloth, and she looked so small, so fragile, that for a moment Ted wanted to hug her, to comfort her, but the anger was stronger, and he held it like a leash, not allowing himself to break loose. With Peter, yeah, I did, she admitted, her voice barely audible. When I was pregnant with Brad, I was scared, Ted. You were always at work, I felt alone, and he was there, he listened, he helped. It was a mistake, I cut it off right after. But Brad, I don't know Ted, I don't know who he is. You don't know? Ted raised his voice and slammed his fist down on the table, making the mug jump. What do you mean, you don't know? You had a baby, Melissa. You can't not know who the father is. She covered her face with her hands, her sobs growing louder, and Ted felt his own eyes sting with tears he refused to let out because he couldn't afford to be weak. Not now, not in front of her. I did what I had to, she said, her voice thick with pain, but also a strange determination. After I found out about your condition, I wanted children, Ted. I wanted a family. For us. For you. I thought it didn't matter who the biological father was. You were their father and all that mattered. You loved them. You raised them. You were there. I thought the truth would never come out. Did you think? Ted almost shouted, his voice shaking with anger and pain. Did you think you could lie to me for the rest of your life? And Mary? William? Was that Peter too, or someone else? How many times have you betrayed me, Melissa? She looked up at him with eyes full of tears, and there was so much pain in them that Ted was silent for a moment, feeling his anger colliding with her pain like two trains rushing towards each other. After Peter, there was no one, she said, her voice weak but sincere. Mary and William. I went to the clinic. The donation. I didn't want to take any more risks. I didn't want any more mistakes. I chose an anonymous donor, Ted. I don't know who they are. I just knew I wanted children, and I wanted you to be their father. For real. Ted sat back in his chair, his mind trying to process her words, but they were like shards of glass, digging into his consciousness. The donation, Peter, the mistake. It all swirled around in his head like a whirlwind, and he didn't know what hurt more, her betrayal with Peter, or the fact that she'd deliberately kept the truth from him, allowing him to live in the illusion that he was a father. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice quieter, but there was so much pain in it that Melissa flinched. Why didn't you trust me? I would have understood. I don't know what I would have done, but I deserved to know. I was afraid, she whispered, her hands shaking as she reached out to him, but he pulled away, unable to bear her touch. I was afraid you'd leave, that you wouldn't forgive me. I loved you, Ted. I do. And I wanted us to have a family. I did this for us. For us? Ted smiled bitterly, his eyes shining with the tears he was still holding back. You ruined us, Melissa. You ruined me. He stood up, not looking at her, and headed for the door, feeling the kitchen, their home, their life, closing in around him like a cage. Melissa was crying, her voice calling to him, but he didn't turn around because he knew that if he looked at her, he would either start crying or screaming, and he wasn't sure he could stop. He walked out into the night, where the rain was still falling, and stood there, letting the water wash away at least some of the pain, but the truth he had learned was too heavy to wash away. Ted Miller looked into the murky mirror of the motel bathroom where he had checked in a week ago and saw in the reflection not the man he once was: a confident, reliable accountant, a father of three, a husband who loved his wife, but a ghost whose eyes were glazed with fatigue and pain, whose cheekbones were sharpened by lack of sleep and missed meals, whose soul was torn apart by contradictions he could not reconcile. The motel on the edge of town, with its faded wallpaper and the smell of old carpet, had become his refuge, a place to hide from Melissa, from her tears, from her confessions that still echoed in his head like distant thunder foreshadowing a storm. He had left the house after that conversation in the kitchen, unable to bear her look, her voice, her attempts to explain what he thought was inexplicable. He left a note, short and dry: "I need time." And he left, not knowing if he would ever return. The days in the motel dragged on like thick syrup, and each one was filled with a struggle between hate and love, fighting in his heart like two beasts tearing each other apart. Hate for Melissa for her lies, for her affair with Peter, for the anonymous donors, for letting him live in an illusion for 26 years. But the love for her, for their children, for Brad and Mary and William was stronger than he wanted to admit, and it haunted him, reminding him of every moment he had held them in his arms, taught them to ride a bike, and wiped away the tears of their first disappointments. They were not his by blood, but they were his by life, by every day they had spent together, by every daddy he had heard with such pride. The thought was both comfort and torment because it made him wonder, could he continue to be their father, knowing the truth? Ted began seeing a psychologist Dr. Harris had recommended, Dr. Linda Carter, a middle-aged woman with a soft voice and eyes that seemed to look into his soul, but not with judgment, only with understanding. Their first meeting was silent. Ted sat in her office, staring at the pattern of the carpet, unable to speak because the truth was too hard to say. Linda took her time, just sitting across from him, holding a notepad but not taking notes, giving him space to breathe, to be. "Ted," she said at the second session, her voice as calm as a lake on a windless day, "you don't have to talk if you're not ready, but when you are, I'm here. Start with what you feel. Don't think, just say it." He looked up at her, his fingers gripping the arms of the chair, and the words he had been holding in for so long finally came out, hoarse and ragged like scraps of old fabric. "I don't know who I am," he said, his voice shaking as he continued. "I thought I was a father, a husband, a man who built a family. And now I'm nobody. My children aren't mine. My wife, she lied to me my whole life. I hate her for it, but I still love her. And the children, and I don't know how to live with it." Linda nodded, her face calm, but there was a warmth in her eyes that Ted hadn't expected to see. "It's a conflict, Ted," she said. "Love and pain often go hand in hand. You feel betrayed, but you also feel connected to these children because you were their father in every way that matters. The question is, will you choose pain or love, or maybe both?" He didn't answer because he didn't know. Weeks passed, and he said nothing. He didn't call Melissa. He didn't respond to her texts that came every day, full of questions, apologies, pleas for him to come back. He saw the kids, but he avoided long conversations, afraid they would notice his distance, his pain. Brad invited him for beers, Mary sent him funny memes, William shared recordings of his new songs, and each time Ted felt his heart torn between the desire to hug them and the fear that he no longer had the right to do so. But William's birthday came, the 21st, a milestone, and Ted couldn't miss it, despite everything that was going on inside him. He stood outside the house, their house, which now seemed foreign to him, and looked up at the windows where the lights were on and voices and laughter came from inside. His hand froze on the doorknob, his heart pounding. but he forced himself inside because William was his son, even if not by blood, and he couldn't let the truth take this moment away from him. It was warm inside, smelling of pizza and the homemade cake Melissa baked every year for the kids. William was sitting at the head of the table, his guitar by his side, laughing at Brad's joke while Mary cut the cake, teasing them both. Melissa was there, her eyes red as if she'd been crying, but she smiled when she saw Ted, and there was such hope in that smile that he felt a twinge of guilt for his silence. "Dad!" William jumped up, his face lit up with joy, and he hugged Ted so tightly that he almost choked. "I thought you weren't coming. How could I miss your birthday?" Ted said, his voice hoarse, but he smiled, and the smile was real, because in that moment he saw his son, his boy, and no tests could change that. "Are you okay?" William asked, his brow furrowing, and Ted realized his son had noticed his tiredness, the shadows under his eyes. "It's okay," Ted lied, patting him on the shoulder. "It's your day, let's celebrate." The evening was full of laughter. Music. William played a new song he'd written and warm memories that Ted tried not to let his thoughts cloud. He looked at Brad, who was telling some ridiculous story about work, at Mary, who was arguing with him, laughing at William, who was winking at him as if they were conspirators, and he felt the love he'd tried to stifle come back, warm and alive and real. They were his children, his family, and no amount of truth could take those moments, those years, that connection away from him. Melissa sat to the side, watching him, and when their eyes met, Ted saw not lies in them, but fear, love, hope. He wasn't ready to forgive her, wasn't ready to go back, but in that moment he realized that the hatred he'd harbored was no stronger than his love for his children, for their life together. He'd made a choice, not a final choice, not a clear choice, but a choice to be here, to be a father, no matter what. When the evening was over and Ted was leaving, William caught up with him at the door. "Dad, are you coming home?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with concern. "We miss you." Ted looked at him, at his face, so familiar, so beloved, and felt tears burning his eyes. "Soon," he said, and it wasn't a lie. I need time, son." William nodded, hugged him again, and Ted walked into the night, feeling that despite the pain, despite the betrayal, he was still their father, and that was the only truth that mattered. The courtroom was quieter than Ted had expected. No scenes, no objections, Your Honor, just the rhythmic click of the secretary's keys and the rustle of papers. He signed the divorce petition and heard no crunching inside, no, more of a steady click, like zipping up a jacket in the wind. Defense, not revenge. Melissa came without a lawyer. In the courtroom, at a table that smelled of cheap starch, she said the first thing. "I don't want war." "Me too," Ted replied. "We'll split the house quietly. The pension is fair. No gossip. No Peter in the conversation." She looked up as if expecting a blow, but there was none. There was only a tired, "Let's go point by point." When they got to the photos, Ted pulled out a box for her. "Take it. Not because I want to forget, because we need to start storing the past differently." They parted not as enemies, but not as friends either. Rather, as people who had finally recognized the limits of each other's pain. Ted decided not to tell the children at home. The house was now a knot of smells and habits. Every glance into the kitchen caught the memory alive. He chose the very shore of the lake where the shutter of the camera once clicked and caught their wet, happy faces. The three of them arrived. Brad, striding along, with his usual grin that didn't linger for long today. Mary, with a book under her arm, as if it might come in handy against any uncertainty. William, with a guitar case, although he had no intention of playing. "Okay, Dad, what's going on?" Brad asked first, shoving his hands into his pockets. The word "Dad" burned and warmed him at the same time. Ted sat down on the bench so that he could see everyone at once and spoke evenly, as Linda Carter had taught him. Facts, pauses, breathing. He talked about the diagnosis, about the tests, about the affair many years ago, about the donation, about the divorce without dirt and scenes. The words came not like knives, but like stones that you finally move from one side of the shore to the other, building something transitional, albeit rough. Mary was the first to find her voice. Is this, is this all true? Then, almost immediately, I'm angry. At Mom, and at you too, for leaving and keeping quiet. But I won't stop coming to your place for dinner. Period. Brad sniffed, turning away in embarrassment. I thought I was going to say something smart. Damn. I'm still going to say, Dad, you can't take it away from me. William was silent for a long time, twirling a stone with his foot. Then he opened the case, pulled out a pick, and, without looking at the strings, said, I'll write a song about it. A bad one, perhaps. But our family has lived through my worst songs. Ted chuckled. His throat tightened, but the words came to him. I didn't choose their birth, but I chose to be their father. A pause. The wind stirred the water at the edge, and the three children, each in their own way, nodded. No hugs for the camera, just decisions that later become habits. They walked until dark. They agreed. Sunday dinners, everyone takes turns at each other's place. Rescue service, a general chat where they write at 3 in the morning if they are really desperate, and no investigations into the past without everyone's consent. We are not detectives, Mary said. We are a family. No one objected to this. Ted's apartment was found quickly a house from the 40s, creaky parquet, a window facing a sycamore tree, which in the fall would definitely dump its leaves into the gutter. He bought a folding table, 2 identical mugs, and a frame for one photo. He leafed through the box brought from the basement for a long time and chose a photo not from the wedding or from that old lake. In the photo, he is holding a bicycle, and little William, concentrating on sticking out his tongue, is learning to keep his balance. The frame is blurry, but alive. He hung a hook for other people's keys nearby just in case. On Thursdays, Ted went to see Linda Carter. They no longer passed over the important things in silence. Pain had names and shapes. He was learning to forgive quietly, not letting go but not passing judgment on a daily basis. Sometimes he thought of Peter and felt a familiar heat in his chest. At such moments, he would take a folded piece of paper from his pocket, his weekly to-do list, and read the item he had written in large letters. Don't waste your life on other people's debts. He and Melissa rarely spoke, but without cold politeness. Once a month, they met at the cafe on the corner. They passed bills, discussed news about the children. One day, she brought an envelope. I found it at Nora's. A letter from 20 years ago. I didn't send it to you then. Forgive me. No need, Ted said, without opening it. We've been reading everything out loud for months now. She nodded and put the envelope back. For the first time in a long time, they sat in silence, and the silence didn't feel like a death sentence. The first Sunday dinner was at Ted's. He was worried like a teenager. He overcooked the chicken, forgot to buy napkins, put out knives with different handles. Mary cleverly saved the sauce. Brad went to get napkins. William turned on the stove and heated up the flatbreads in 5 minutes. When they sat down, it became clear that the table was cramped. Elbows were touching. Plates were clanking. Someone was constantly getting up for water. And it was in this cramped space that their old, recognizable music arose again. Brad's squabble with Mary, Ted's grumbling about the volume, William's whispers over the phone, where he was recording the melody, Daddy's knife makes a noise like a train. Later, at the sink where the dishes were rattling, Brad quieted down and said, I thought everything would fall apart for me. But it turned out that it wouldn't. It would just work out differently. That's adult magic, Ted replied. Nothing disappears, it just changes form. In the winter, a branch broke off the sycamore. Ted was out with his pruning shears, fiddling around with gloves, when a familiar car pulled up to the side of the road. Melissa rolled down the window. I'm going to the library. Need a ride? I'll go on foot, he smiled. I want to freeze and feel alive. She nodded. For a second, the smile turned serious. Thank you for not hurting me more than I already did. There's no need for anything else, he said. There's something to do. And it really was. Ted had developed a nightly habit, sorting digital photos, not throwing them away, but captioning them so his memory wouldn't get confused. We're at the doctor's, 2004. Brad laughs because his trouser leg is caught in a tire. Mary reading by the window. First session. Will at his first concert singing out of tune and happy. He realized that the truth wasn't just the diagnoses and names in the columns, but also these captions and the laughter and his voiceover. Well done. In the spring, they went to the lake again. No ceremonial photographer, no coincidences of lighting. Just the five of them, different than then, but still together. Mary brought a thermos of tea, Brad an absurd inflatable ball, William that bad song that was unexpectedly tolerable. Melissa stood aside, not interfering, and Ted did not chase her away. He finally saw their shared history was not divided by moral scissors into before and after. It was all seams that held better if sewn anew. Go ahead, William said, throwing on his guitar strap. The verse is as it was, the chorus is as it will be. Can you give me the signal? Ted winked and slapped his hand on his knee, setting the rhythm. 1, 2, 3, and the music began to flow like water after a long drought. He didn't know what the next year would be like. Perhaps the sycamore would be broken by the wind again. Perhaps he would have to change houses or jobs. Perhaps Mary would move to another city, and Brad would have children of his own. And then there would be another pair of small forks at Sunday dinners. But he did know that in the kitchen, where it was crowded and loud, there would always be a hook for other people's keys and a place on the wall for a picture of someone learning to balance. I didn't choose their birth, yes, but every day I chose anew to put my hand under the wound, to be an elbow on a cramped table, a voice that says, I'm here. And this turned out to be stronger than any blood. He looked at the children adults, but still his, and suddenly realized that he had already made the hardest choice. Not to stay in the past, to stay with them. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.